According to what we are taught in school, two shots were fired in Sarajevo to start World War I. We are informed that the killing of an archduke started a chain reaction that nobody desired and that it was a horrible accident of alliances. However, this is a kid-friendly view of history. It is the interpretation that disregards the harsh reality of empire's economy. You must go beyond the assassination if you want to comprehend why millions of soldiers lost their lives in the trenches and why the Middle East is depicted as it is today. Find the one thing that scared the British Empire more than any army or fleet by looking at a map of the world in 1900. It wasn't a weapon, it was a line of trains. This is the Berlin-Baghdad Railway story. It is the tale of an iron road that was supposed to circumvent the British monopoly on international trade and link the Middle East's oil reserves to the center of Europe. It tells how the Ottoman Empire attempted to break free from the financial enslavement of Paris and London, but fell into a trap that would ultimately lead to its annihilation. We must first comprehend the world at the turn of the 20th century in order to comprehend this catastrophe. The world was undeniably ruled by the British Empire. There were two pillars supporting its strength. The first was the Royal Navy, which dominated all of the main shipping lanes in the seas. The Suez Canal in Egypt was the second. The empire's lifeblood was the Suez Canal. India, the gem in the crown of the British system, could only be swiftly reached in this manner. Britain maintained control over who was allowed to trade with the East as long as they held Suez. If you were a Russian or German trader wishing to ship products to China or India, you had to go through British checkpoints. You have to follow British regulations. However, a new power was emerging in the center of Europe. After uniting in 1871, Germany was growing into a massive industrial power. British factories were being outproduced by German factories. German science was admired worldwide. But there was an issue with Germany. They didn't have an empire. They lacked large colonies to supply inexpensive raw materials. Worst of all, they lacked a fleet capable of opposing the British. Encircled by adversaries and isolated from international markets by the British Navy, Germany was a colossus stuck in the middle of Europe. The Ottoman Empire was located to the southeast at the same period. The Ottomans have been a powerhouse for ages. However, they were referred to be Europe's ill man by the late 1800s. The interior of the empire was decaying. In the Balkans, they had lost land. Although their army was antiquated, debt was their main issue. The loans due to French and British banks were overwhelming the Ottoman administration. The empire had collapsed by 1881. They were compelled to cede control of their own economy to the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in order to repay their creditors. The Ottoman citizens' taxes were really collected by this board of European financiers. The Sultan did not get the proceeds from the sale of salt, silk, or tobacco by a Turkish peasant. It ended up in a Parisian or London bank vault. Abdulhamid II, the Sultan at the time, was in dire straits. He was aware that foreign wealth was devouring his dominion. He had to find a means to protect his borders and develop his nation without depending on the same individuals who were stealing him. Infrastructure was necessary for him. In order to transport troops from Constantinople to the desert boundaries in a matter of days instead of months, Alexander needed a railway. However, he was aware that if he requested the French or British to construct it, they would just exploit it to strengthen their hold. Here, the Ottoman Empire's and Germany's ambitions clashed in a perfect storm. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany recognized a chance that would permanently alter the balance of power. Germany might completely avoid the British Empire if they could construct a railway from Berlin to Constantinople and then extend it all the way to Baghdad in the Persian Gulf. Consider the geometry involved. Without ever seeing a British ship, a train carrying German steel or chemicals might depart Berlin, pass via Vienna, cross the Balkans, enter Turkey, and reach the Indian Ocean. The Royal Navy would be unable to access the vast overland commerce route it would establish. It would bring together the Middle East's abundant natural resources with Germany's industrial might. It was a lifeline for the Sultan. It was Germany's route to global dominance. It was a nightmare for Britain. German engineers and funding were used to start construction. The biggest German bank, Deutsche Bank, took the initiative. In its day, the engineering was a marvel. They had to dig railroads over hot deserts and blast tunnels into the popular mountains. Panic struck in London as the rails headed east. Upon examining the chart, the British strategic strategists noticed a dagger aimed at the center of their empire. German forces may pose a danger to the Suez Canal if the railway was finished. German traders might overrun India's markets with inexpensive items. However, something else existed that was much riskier than trading. Oil. Oil was just now starting to take the place of coal as the Navy's fuel. Oil was found to burn cleaner and hotter than coal by the British. Ships were able to go farther and stay at sea longer because to it. The leader of the Royal Navy, Admiral Fisher, is credited with saying that the fleet had to switch to oil in order to survive. However, Britain's own island was devoid of oil. They were dependent on American and Persian supply. Geologists were starting to recognize that the area where the Baghdad Railway would pass through Mesopotamia, known as Iraq, was resting on an oil sea. For 20 kilometers on either side of the railroad track, the Germans had obtained the mining rights. This implied that Germany would control the tap that ignited future wars if the railroad was completed. They would be in charge of the oil required to keep the British Navy afloat. The British establishment determined that the sea could not be reached by this railway. To halt it, they employed every weapon in their arsenal. They attempted diplomacy first. The Sheikh of Kuwait, a little region at the end of the line, was forced to make a covert deal with Britain. Without approval from the British, the Sheikh promised not to lease any property to foreign nations. The railway was essentially prevented from having a terminus on the Persian Gulf as a result. The railway went nowhere as a result of the strategic checkmate. Then the press was utilized. British newspapers launched a propaganda campaign against the Ottoman Empire, denouncing them as barbarians and blaming the Germans of encouraging despotism. They saw the railroad as an instrument of tyranny rather than a means of commerce. Lastly, they made use of London's finance system. No British capital was permitted to invest in the project by the global financial center. The Germans continued to develop despite their attempts to deprive the railway of money. The trains had reached southern Turkey's highlands by 1914. The project was almost finished. The danger was growing actual. The start of World War I must be understood in this light, since tensions between the major countries went beyond European border issues and national pride. They were concerned who would be in charge of the global economy in the future. Britain, France, and Russia created the Triple Ant-Alliance with the express purpose of encircling Germany and halting its progress. Russia intended to eliminate the Ottomans, and they were afraid that the railway would make them stronger. Britain was afraid of India and Suez, while France was afraid of German economic domination. Berlin was not the first location the British forces searched when the war began. The Middle East was the location. The Ottoman Empire's tragedy was that they were crushed between the European powers, despite their attempts to harness their competition to their advantage. In the hopes that a German triumph would absolve them of their obligations to Britain and France, they joined the war on Germany's side. In order to assist them reclaim their lost territories in Egypt and the Caucasus, they thought the railway would deliver German weapons and supplies. However, they had underestimated the British Empire's brutal resolve. The British were engaged in more than a mere army loss. They were battling over a resource. A British expeditionary force was dispatched to Basra in southern Iraq as soon as the conflict started. They were supposed to defend the Abadan oil facility, but their true objective was to march north. They were on the incomplete railway's course. They were advancing to protect Kirk and Mosul's oil resources before the Germans arrived. The Middle East conflict was horrific. The soldiers in Mesopotamia perished from sickness and heat exhaustion, whereas the men in Europe perished in mud. A whole British army was forced to surrender to the Ottomans at the Siege of Kut, one of the terrible setbacks the British endured. However, the Ottomans were operating on thin air, while the British had limitless resources. There was still work to be done on the railway that was meant to save them. The paths through the mountains had holes in them. German supplies had to be unloaded, transported across the passes on a truck or camel, and then put back into trains. The Ottoman war effort was stifled by this obstacle. The outcome of the war may have been substantially different if the railway had been completed 5 years earlier. The British were able to reorganize and finally take Jerusalem and Baghdad because they were unable to transport soldiers and supplies fast enough. The British and French administrations met covertly to determine what would happen to the Ottoman territories as the war continued. They didn't hold off till the conflict was over. Mark Sykes and Sykes-Picot, two diplomats, took a seat with a map and a pencil in 1916. They drew borders throughout the Middle East that disregarded geography, religious sects, and ethnic boundaries. However, a thorough examination of the Sykes-Picot Agreement reveals that the lines nearly exactly match the known locations of oil resources and the intended route of the Baghdad Railway. The port of Haifa in Palestine and the southern portion of Iraq were claimed by Britain. Syria and Lebanon were claimed by France. To make sure that no one power could ever challenge their hegemony again, they were dismembering the empire. The railway, which was supposed to bring the area together, ended up dividing it. It was a complete betrayal. If the Arabs rebelled against the Ottomans, they would be granted independence. These uprisings were headed by Lawrence, also referred to as Lawrence of Arabia, who destroyed the very railroads the Ottomans depended on. However, the Arabs did not receive their independence after the conflict. They were under colonial French and British administration. The Ottoman Empire came to an end. The Sultan was overthrown. They abolished the caliphate. There was no forgiveness of the loan, was only reorganized to be paid by the newly formed countries that emerged from the empire. The British Empire had been successful. The German menace had been neutralized. Most significantly, they had taken control of the oil that would fuel the 20th century and guarded the path to India. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was dismantled. There were now several portions in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. It was never the united commerce route that it was intended to be. The idea of a steel silk road was no longer feasible. We are still coping with the void left in the Middle East by the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the collapse of the Baghdad Railway. However, 1918 was not the end of the narrative. The spirit of that railroad really lingered in the area throughout the remainder of the 20th century and has made a triumphant comeback in the 21st. The British and French ruled the Middle East following World War I, but they had an issue. Even though they had taken control of the land and the oil, they still had to get it to Europe. They now controlled the Baghdad Railway, which had been the source of so much anxiety. However, it was damaged. New barriers were formed by the boundaries they had drawn. A train now had to pass through 3 separate customs borders on its way from Baghdad to Europe. It had to contend with 3 distinct colonial governments and 3 distinct currencies. The region's economic cohesion was destroyed. This was deliberate. A fragmented, weak, and dependent Middle East was favored by the colonial powers over a unified one that may pose a threat to them. The British prioritized pipeline construction above railroad construction in the years after the war. Controlling pipelines was easy. They just transported oil, not people or ideas. The British, French, and American oil titans came together to build the Iraq Petroleum Company. From Iraq's Kirk oil reserves to the Mediterranean shore, they constructed a pipeline. Though the revenues went primarily to the west this time, the pipeline's strategic reasoning was nearly identical to that of the previous railway project. While their own infrastructure remained inadequate, the people of the Middle East witnessed their riches being extracted from their land and moved elsewhere. The Ottoman Sultan's goal of modernity gave way to an extractionist reality. However, the Baghdad Railway's strategic idea never really disappeared. The prospect of building a land bridge that would link Europe and Asia is just too compelling to pass up. The railway regained its prominence during World War II. Nazi Germany turned to the east once more. Hitler hoped to have access to the Caucasus and Iraqi oil. To incite insurrection against the British, German operatives were dispatched to Iraq. They pledged to complete the work that the Kaiser had begun. In order to protect the oil resources and the transportation lines, the British had to invade Iraq once more. History was being repeated, nearly verbatim. The conflicts were placed in somewhat different places, but the prize was the same. Take charge of the hallway. Take charge of the planet. The burden of its own debts caused the British Empire to fall apart following World War II. The United States took over to cover the gap. Although they employed various strategies, the Americans carried on the British fixation with dominating the Middle East. They employed alliances and coups as an alternative to direct colonial control. However, a competing force controlling the Eurasian continent frightened them just as much. The Soviet Union was the new bogeyman during the Cold War. The U.S. was concerned that the same mountain passes that the Baghdad Railway passed through may be flooded by Soviet tanks. Due to its location on the world's most valuable real estate, the choke point between the East and the West, rather than its democracy, Turkey emerged as a crucial NATO partner. Let's go on to the 21st century. There are horrifying similarities between the time of the Baghdad Railway and the present. The prevailing naval empire is currently under competition from a new emerging industrial force. The new Germany is China, the Belt and Road Initiative is the new Baghdad Railway, and the United States is the new British Empire. The Chinese leadership is aware of their vulnerability at sea, much like Kaiser Wilhelm was. The Pacific shipping routes in the Indian Ocean are dominated by the U.S. Navy. The United States might impose a blockade on China and deprive its economy of energy in the case of a war. Therefore, China is constructing enormous infrastructure projects all throughout the continent of Eurasia, roadways, pipelines, and high-speed rail links that provide overland connections between China and Europe and the Middle East. Examine the Belt and Road Initiative map. On a much greater scale, it resembles the map of the Baghdad Railway almost identically. It aims to get around the American Navy's choke spots. It aims to create a unified economic bloc that does not include the United States by combining the economies of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. And the Americans are in a panic, exactly like the British were in the 1900s. The headlines in the newspapers are the same. The Chinese projects are referred to as debt traps. They claim that China backs autocrats. They want to prevent Chinese businesses from constructing 5G networks and purchasing ports. In a century, the language has hardly altered. It's the same strategic worry. We may learn from the history of the Baghdad Railway that a waning empire would retaliate if it perceives that an infrastructure project will challenge its dominion. To prevent the link from being established, it will employ propaganda, financial warfare, and ultimately military force. Once more, the chessboard on which this game is being played is the Middle East. The tensions in Iran, the instability in Turkey, and the battles in Iraq and Syria all occur along the same fault lines where the trains were installed a century ago. It's not an accident, it's geography. The Ottoman Empire's tragedy can serve as a cautionary tale. The Ottomans believed that they could pit Europeans against one another. They believed they could continue to be independent while using German funds to develop their nation. However, inviting a superpower to construct your vital infrastructure is more than just purchasing concrete and steel. Their geopolitical adversaries are being imported by you. You are creating a target out of your land. The train that was meant to bring wealth instead brought disaster. The empire was shattered by the armies it brought. Many emerging countries now have to make the same decision as the Sultan did. They are ravenous for progress. They require power plants, railroads, and bridges. China pledges to construct them quickly and cheaply. The West advises them to avoid them. They are enmeshed in a conflict that is far more significant than themselves. The Baghdad Railway teaches us that structures are never neutral. Never is a road simply a road. It is a power vector. And before they allow their competitors to dominate commerce, the ruling class will set the world on fire. We frequently assume that religious or old-fashioned animosities are to blame for the instability in the Middle East when we watch the news today. The conflict between civilizations is what we are told. However, if you go into the past, you will find the corroded iron lines of an abandoned German railroad. You discover the ruins of a failed commercial transaction. You discover evidence suggesting the Middle East's borders were not established to establish states. They were enticed to halt a train. The collapse of the Baghdad Railway influenced our globe, the conflicts we wage, and the gas station rates we pay. The planet is still being destroyed by the train that never came.